I also just want to echo our gratitude to the National Constitution Center for welcoming us so warmly today, and it is always a particular privilege for me to be in Philadelphia because this is where my husband grew up and my mother-in-law is here tonight. So, oh yeah, please, absolutely. So really, it's just an honor to be here, but also just such a personal privilege. So to pick up on where my mother left off, it was a real joy to work together in many respects because we were able to revisit and I was able to kind of excavate some of my kind of most treasured memories from childhood of my mother talking to me about the women who had really kind of galvanized and motivated her as a little girl. And I remembered hearing those stories as a kid, whether it was kind of Nancy Drew or her sixth grade teacher, and then the women that she really came to admire as she got older, particularly Shirley Chisholm and Geraldine Ferraro, who I remember her taking me to see when I was 4 years old and she came to Arkansas. And yet there also were some challenging aspects to our collaboration. Not only did we each have to kind of vigorously kind of go to the mat for the women we felt like had to be included, as our editor continued to tell us that no, we couldn't have a book that weighed 8 pounds, which is what I think it would have been had we had every woman we wanted to initially, but also because we have very different working styles. So I type on a computer. Like I write on a computer. I may outline still, like pen to paper, but I write on a computer. I edit on a computer. My mother writes longhand. And while I knew this, I didn't quite understand what that would mean for our collaboration together. So what that meant, I would send attachments of my most recent essays to her, and she would take photographs and text them to me of whatever essay she just finished. Thankfully, she has pretty legible handwriting, but it made it hard to then kind of go back and forth with different suggested edits or ideas or kind of where I wanted to add in my voice. And I kept saying to her, Google Docs are your friends, or we can just work in comment boxes and track changes. I'll show you, we have different colors. It's very easy to follow the lines of logic and editing. And she just kept saying, this has worked for me. So after about a month of continuing to kind of plea and try to persuade, maybe even a little bit of loving guilt tripping, I just realized none of it was working. And I had to accept that we had very different writing styles, but hopefully kind of could still merge them together, even if one started kind of longhand and one started on a computer.
Okay. I have to say, in my defense, you know who else writes longhand?
She said this to me literally every day that we were working together.
Barack Obama writes his books longhand.
Every
I rest
day.
my case.
Every day. She was like, you know what? President Obama does it too. And I was like, you know what? I bet Sasha and Malia wish he didn't as well. So, I mean,
Touche. Okay, well, the book, it definitely reads like a conversation. So the great thing about it, for those of you who are obviously all here and going to read the book, is that you sort of are conversing back and forth, either writing an essay, but then having a bit of you and a bit of you. You're sort of mixing together. But you start off with, I want to start off with your first impressions in the book, which is really one of the most poignant parts of it. You start out writing about Dorothy Rodham, Grandma Dorothy, and Virginia Kelly, Grandma Ginger. Talk a little bit about these two phenomenal women who mean so much, obviously, to both of you.
Well, when we started this conversation about our different experiences growing up, because when I was growing up, when I was a young girl, the only women I knew who worked outside the home were my teachers and the public school librarians. And Chelsea had a very different experience. So we talked about the people we knew closely in our families who influenced us, who we admired, who we thought were gutsy. And then, of course, people that we encountered, including fictional, as well as historical and contemporary women. And I think it's fair to say that you know, my mother and Bill's mother were two of the gutsiest women that I've ever known. And certainly for Chelsea, having those two women as her grandmothers was incredibly formative. She had my mother until she was an adult, so she could really develop a relationship with her. Sadly, Bill's mother died when she was just 12. So we talked a lot about that, and we thought, oh, really, we need to start with those two women. Do you want to add to that?
I mean, I am so grateful to my grandmothers. And as my mom said, my grandma Dorothy was a huge part of my life and still very much remains so. Like, I think about her every day, probably because in the last years of her life I spoke to her every day, and she still really remains my North Star. I often think, like, what would she advise me to do? Kind of what would she think would be the right thing to do in this moment? One of the gifts that both my grandmothers gave me, though, was kind of the expectation of having an opinion and standing up for myself. And I felt that so clearly when my grandma Ginger asked me what I wanted for my 8th birthday, and I told her I wanted her to quit smoking. And she did. And she'd smoked 2 packs of cigarettes for decades. But I think she was so impressed that I had the gumption to ask for that. And that she had been she loved the word gumption, and she'd been talking to me a lot about, like, why it was so important that girls have gumption, that she thought, well, heck, like, I better follow through on this. And just what a gift that she gave me. And I'm so grateful, because it certainly, after she got breast cancer, probably helped her live a little bit longer, because her lungs by that point had really largely recovered. So I am so thankful to both my grandmothers, and Joy, we couldn't have written this book and not included them.
But Joy, we also want people to think about the gutsy women in their lives, because every person here knows at least one, probably more than one, or are yourselves, and starting from the personal and then going to the historical was a way of us, we hoped, igniting a conversation about that.
And you know, gutsy women almost always get a great deal of opposition. There is still, you know, even in the 21st century, it feels like there's this great social prohibition to women stepping forward, seeking power, to women exercising their power. I think about what the Speaker of the House currently goes through, the pushback, and you wonder if she would get the same pushback if she were a man, right? You wonder it all the time. You wrote about a young woman who's experiencing that, and she is still a child. And her name is Greta Thunberg. And I love that you included her here. This is actually one of my favorite essays in the book. Talk a little bit about not only standing up for yourself, but as a young woman who's fighting for something huge and important, and doing that despite the fact that people are, I mean, the viciousness of the attacks against her have been something, I mean, you can probably resonate.
I have a little idea what that's
a
like.
little bit.
And so do you, I know.
Okay.
We included Greta in the book before she sailed across the ocean and spoke at the UN, because we were both so impressed with her lonely campaign to raise awareness about what needs to be done to try to stop the effects of climate change, frankly, before it's too late for many parts of the world. You know, she started off going on her own to the government buildings in Stockholm, and she was literally by herself, and nobody joined her. And then eventually a couple of kids joined her, and then, as we know, it led to a global effort to raise awareness about climate change that enlisted millions of young people. There were several things that I think we both were drawn to when it came to including Greta. First, that she was just unapologetically a 16-year-old girl. She didn't pretend to be anybody else but herself. And she very quickly told people that she was autistic. She had a form of autism on the Asperger's spectrum, and she owned up to it. And she was, again, fearless and unapologetic. And then, as we watched her be willing to put herself out there to speak truth to power and engender wild support, great adulation from those who saw what she was trying to do and believed in her, and then the most negative, vicious attacks on her girlhood, on her autism, on how she spoke, and everything else that the other side could think of to try to diminish her. It just made us even more proud that we'd included her. But I think that for both of us, she was a real example of what young women are doing around the world on a lot of important issues.
Yeah. And also the need to stand up for facts and science. And that she just is so kind of consistently and persistently clear that she's not voicing her opinions. You know, she is amplifying and elevating kind of what the overwhelming majority of scientists are telling us about climate change and kind of what they are kind of urging and exhorting us to do, what we must do. And Joy, just since kind of we're here tonight, I want to mention Tony Pergolin and Judy London, who are from Bancroft, because one of the women that we write about in the book is Margaret Bancroft, who kind of in the late mid-19th century, when she was a teacher here in Pennsylvania, believed that every child deserved the right to an education and that every child could learn. And that was not the prevailing view at the time. And when she said she wanted to start kind of her own school to be able to kind of bring that philosophy into the world, that regardless of ability, every child could learn, you know, she was also really derided and denigrated and told, like, why would she bother? Like, why would she bother with these kids? And she just was dogged and determined, and the school and organization that she started still exists today, and among its many kind of achievements is one of the largest sources of American Special Olympians, which I think is pretty fantastic.
So one of the things I enjoyed the most about the book is it's sort of a catalog of a lot of, you know, my heroines, you know, Shirley Chisholm probably being, you know, growing up, like the biggest heroine in my household. She's part Guyanese. My mom's a bit biased. Mae Jemison, like people like that. But I love the fact that you also, in some parts of the book, combine someone known with someone who is less known. People should know Claudette Colvin, but people tend not to, and they tend to, you know Rosa Parks. Everybody knows who Rosa Parks is. She decided she didn't want to sit in the back of the bus, but the fact that Claudette Colvin was another teenager who did it first, I love that you all included her.
So I think that Claudette Colvin is one of the great, holding her down in her seat. Couldn't get up. She was arrested. She was dragged off the bus. She was horrifically treated while she was in jail. Her father and the local pastor had to plea and work and raise money to help get her out of jail. She gets out of jail. Kind of people tell her she needs to be quiet, and she just says no. And so she became one of the original plaintiffs, one of the 5 original plaintiffs in Browder v. Yale, which was the ruling ultimately by a district court, upheld by the Supreme Court, that said no, like bus segregation is illegal. It's illegal in Montgomery and it's illegal in the state of Alabama. And so while we know Rosa Parks' name, really justly, we should know Claudette's too, because she was 15 and her story is part of what propelled finally desegregating public transportation in Alabama.
Yeah. And there's a clap. You include some of the people that are some of my have become some of my favorite people, the young women of the Parkland students, who are so brave and who came forward and became the face of really probably the most successful, I think, to date, gun reform movement, really since 1994, when there was an assault weapons ban actually somehow passed the Congress. When you look at this kind of advocacy, particularly since you've spent so much time in public policy, people tend not to think that there will be anything actually done. These kids don't believe that.
Right. Well, the gun violence is a huge issue for both Chelsea and me, and we wrote about 2 groups of women and I'll speak about the older generation, and Chelsea will speak about the younger, which is totally appropriate, I think. And as Joy said, one of the characteristics of all these women in our book, despite whatever obstacles they faced or how badly they were treated, is optimism. They really believe that something will change and that they're going to play a role in making sure that it does. So we highlight women who've been involved in the gun violence prevention efforts for quite some time. Women like Sarah Brady, whose husband James was so severely wounded when there was the assassination attempt against President Reagan, paralyzed in a wheelchair. Sarah Brady became the voice of gun reform, and she really was instrumental in getting the Brady Bill passed, which also passed in 1994 that my husband signed, and it has kept something like 2.5 million people from getting guns who shouldn't. Just imagine that, because they've been stopped at that process. Or Gabby Giffords, who was herself the victim of an assassination attempt. And after being so profoundly wounded and working so hard to come back through physical therapy and speech therapy, she and her wonderful husband, Mark Kelly, have been leading the charge for sensible gun legislation. And Nelba Marquez Green, whose little girl was murdered at Sandy Hook, and who talks about the burdens and the pain that family members feel. And Lucy McBath, whose son Jordan was killed for playing music too loud in his car. And the man did go to prison, thankfully, but Lucy, despite being devastated by the terrible murder of her son, said she had to do something, and she became a gun prevention activist, and now she's a member of Congress. So we try to talk about women who have been on the front lines and have often taken their own tragedies and tried to convince people that something had to be done. But this group of young people, like what Joy was talking about, are really a new phenomenon. They came out of Parkland, they came out of other gun-related tragedies, and they are absolutely determined that it's going to be a voting issue and that people are going to get the changes that they are seeking to try to save lives.
And we highlight 6 young women activists because while I think so much attention has kind of been focused on the Parkland students and on Emma Gonzalez, what I think has been really remarkable about the Parkland students is how they have, from the beginning of dealing with this horrific tragedy that affected all of them, understood that they were not the only ones who were affected. And they really have not only shared the spotlight, but given their platform to others who are working on different aspects of our kind of gun violence epidemic in our country. And so we write about Naomi Wadler, whose mother had gone to high school with Fred Gutenberg, whose daughter was murdered at Parkland. And kind of as Naomi was learning about this horror and how it affected her family, she felt like she had to do something. So at 11 years old, she started her own school strike of kind of kids walking out, kind of protesting gun violence. And then she spoke at kind of March for Our Lives about the need to really understand in so many instances, it's black girls who suffer the highest rates of gun violence in our country. We also write about Jasmine Wildcat, who has really taken on kind of the challenges of gun violence, not only in her own Native American community, but in other Native American communities. We write about Julia Spohr, who my mother and I met a few days ago in Washington, D.C., whose father died by suicide, kind of with a gun. And she and her mother had kind of worked to raise awareness of the suicide epidemic in our country. And then after the tragedy in Parkland, she felt like she had to do more, and she started Students Demand Action, which now has more than 40,000 members. So just kind of these young women, Joy, who are not only kind of determined to change the status quo are racing ahead and supporting each other to do so kind of at every level of government with every opportunity. And I just am in awe of them, and particularly as a mother, incredibly grateful to them.
Yeah, absolutely. Well, speaking of women who made history, you do write about Frances Perkins, who's the reason we have Social Security. We can give that a hell. Well, we do love Social Security, right? We can give that a hell. And you write about women, you know, from this era when women were not supposed to be part of government, were not supposed to be making decisions. So I'm going to set that aside. I'd love for you to talk about Frances Perkins and why and you write about Eleanor Roosevelt, who I know is your idol. We're here in the National Constitution Center. So I want to ask you, as somebody who is an attorney, as somebody who was an attorney on that commission that looked at Richard Nixon's potential crimes and what needed to be done with him, whether or not, you know, the idea of gutsy women, right, is that you're standing up to power, that you're standing up for the people who are in need, which is what Ms. Perkins managed to do. I wonder if you see the same kind of potential and resiliency to overcome what really feels to a lot of people, I think, like a constitutional crisis right now. And if so, who is it? Who do you see out there now that has the strength to stand up really for the Constitution, given the state of affairs in 1600 Pennsylvania Avenue?
Well, how appropriate that we would talk about a constitutional crisis such as the one we are in right here at the Constitution Center. And I want to thank Jeffrey Rosen for his leadership and for what this center really means. It's a living, breathing reminder of how the Constitution was created and how we have not only tried to change it in ways that furthered the underlying ideals of our country, but also tried to understand what it is our founders were teaching us when we look at it. And there is a reason there is a section on impeachment in the Constitution. And as Joy said, I had the rather unusual experience of being on the impeachment inquiry staff back in 1974 investigating Richard Nixon, and one of my assignments as a young lawyer was to write the memo that was later published with a few other of my colleagues about what is a high crime and misdemeanor. And clearly the founders said to themselves, look, we're going to have elections, and that will represent, we hope, the will of the people. But in between elections, if we have a leader who is abusing power, obstructing justice, treating the rest of the government with contempt, we have to have a remedy. And so impeachment, rooted in sort of Anglo-Saxon law going back to the English, became the remedy that the founders put into our Constitution. Now, why is that important? Because if you go back and you read some of the early debates and some of the writings around the Constitution, what was one thing they were particularly worried about? They were worried about foreign interference in the government. They were worried that foreign powers would try to subvert the government of the United States through influencing elected leaders or appointed leaders. It was a very real concern to our founders. And so we are now at the point where we have an impeachment inquiry beginning. Evidence is being presented and being evaluated. And then the House will have to make a decision as to whether or not there is enough evidence to support articles of impeachment. Personally, I think that there's a really good case that there is enough evidence to support articles of impeachment. So, and I think it's really important, as Joy was asking, to look at the people who are now on the leading edge of this momentous, historic moment. And the person who's furthest out is the Speaker, Nancy Pelosi, who is a very gutsy woman, and she has really tried very hard to handle this and with the seriousness and deliberativeness that it requires. But what is particularly missing are any people in the opposite party who are speaking up, because back in 1974, Republican members of the House of Representatives who served on the Judiciary Committee voted for the articles of impeachment. Republican senators, after the House Judiciary Committee vote, went to see Richard Nixon and said, "You should resign for the good of the country." They put country over party. We write about a woman who does that in our book, Margaret Chase Smith, the Republican senator from Maine, who was the first member of her party to take on Joseph McCarthy. And she gave a stunning speech on the floor of the Senate, speaking about how important it was to not only take him on for the good of the country, but for the good of the Republican Party. And if you go back and you read that, and we quote from it in the book, you have to ask yourself, where is anybody from the Republican Party willing to be the Margaret Chase Smith? You know, there's one obvious candidate who happens to be a woman Republican senator from Maine who could take on that role, but there are others as well. And so it is especially important at this moment for citizens to educate themselves, to learn about what impeachment is and what it isn't, to understand the reason the founders put it in the document to begin with, and to follow the evidence, because we're getting more and more evidence all the time about abuse of power, about obstruction of justice, and about contempt of Congress. And this assault on our rule of law and our checks and balances among the three branches of government is a serious threat to our democracy and to our Constitution.